So the disturbance regime being in place. I wanted to put this in there to give you an example of the type of graph I'll give. Because I am a bit of a, I'm data challenged, given that I'm a little bit ADD and I don't have as strong of an attention span as my friend Bill does there. But I am going to try a couple of graphs. And these are very generalized. So your old conceptual thing about wildlife would respond to habitat availability, carrying capacity, limiting factor. Anybody ever take a wildlife class? You see this graph. This is the classic. The population rises and then goes around that. And I don't know why I put this in here right now that Bill's thing is in here. But you might have an immediate fire effect. And Bill just said this, and I'm really pleased that this kind of is borne out to the dense forest types. Then immediately after the fires, the habitat is diminished, the carrying capacity is down, at least for the time being, particularly in some species. And so I'm essentially hinting at the topic that Bill explained very well about the changes in the populations given the type of forest that the animal is particularly adapted to. And there are direct mortalities, and I threw this in there because this was at our house. Some of you know what happened in the Rising Eagle fire. My house is in the middle of it, and it almost burned down. The firefighters saved our house, and we got to walk around on our property afterwards, and we found burned up chipmunks, a whole bunch of them. It was surprising how many. The little yellow pines were found a wren. We found a house wren that had burned up. We found rubber boas that had come above ground and had gotten burned up. And the dogs found a whole bunch of chipmunks, and they ate them. But little crispy critters. So it surprised me. And what happened was the shrub layer there burned so hot that things didn't get away. And now, ironically, since I'm speaking of it, professionally I've been advocating for snags for 25 years, and now I own a snag patch. You see my article in the paper, talking snags? So it's pretty interesting what happened there. So after the fire, though, indeed, as things recovered, the shrub species, the snags have got to get a little bit of softness to them to get cavities in them. But there will be this tremendous response by a lot of species. And so fire is not necessarily bad news for wildlife. And so that's a simplistic version of what Bill said, but without any error bars. So just back to the dry forest ecology, and this is really intended as a background in case we hadn't have had such an interesting talk just before me, but the fact that indeed the fires maintain the habitat. I find that a terribly interesting factoid, that the forest habitat that had the frequent fires was the most stable ecologically. And we're going to hint at how your human activities can mimic that a little bit. And so, you know, the fire, this whole thing about, okay, repeat after me, only you.
Forest fires.
The most successful ad campaign in history. And now we're kind of going, but we didn't quite mean it. That's what we're doing. Although if your house is out in the middle of the woods, you do mean it. So anyway, we get So is fire always bad? Not necessarily. Doug, this is on your wildlife area. No, Jamie, your wildlife area. Right there by the headquarters. And here's a great example of a scan that had been in the past. The fire went through there. Look at the survival. It looks good. So sometimes, yeah, it can actually create stability in forests, particularly in the dry series. I don't need to say more about that. But we got a lot of this out there now. And this reality check of fire suppression, and the fact that these trees, these ponderosa pines, these Douglas firs, some of these low elevation trees, because they were adapted to this continuous disturbance, they crank out the seeds. They like crank out, baby trees. And so you give them any chance at all, and you wind up with these naturally regenerated stands of incredible density. You could have, 4,000 stems to the acre, Jamie? Yeah, and what are we looking for? 50? Ish, 35 to 50, and we've got 4,000? There was a joke that says now in Eastern Washington, if you're going to have an Earth Day event, instead of giving somebody a tree to plant, you give them a certificate to go cut down 5. Right. So you might want to hug them after you cut them. But that's the little one, so we're going to get to this. So this is what we're dealing with, and we've got some problems. And I find that terribly interesting that these closed canopy stands with research are actually some of the worst habitat. They don't produce very many cones, there's no understory, there's no cavities, the trees are too small, birds can't fly through them. Some of your richest habitats are actually the more open ones with some snags and some big trees and a nice shrub layer, and the data shows that. So, these are our current conditions, and this is what people buy. So I'm going to put on my DNR, landowner assistance hat for a second, and you'd be amazed how many people buy a piece of property and don't have any idea what they just bought. And I'm one of them, I admit it. We got this patch of bitterbrush, man, it was 6 feet high, it was the coolest shrub, it never even occurred to me how flammable it was. But a lot of people will buy something like this, and they'll say, oh no, I don't want to cut any trees. And so you have this really interesting dilemma of like, well, what do you want? Well, I love nature. Okay, let's talk. So that's where we are. So we've got a whole bunch of this stuff. No, and it's terribly interesting because who goes and buys a piece of property out in the sticks? Somebody who loves nature, somebody who wants to do the right thing, but we don't necessarily know. So anyway, that's what we're here. So this is what we're dealing with in many cases. And indeed, the low-intensity fire maintain these forests. And if you crank one of these things in there, your outcome is going to be kind of like Bill pointed out. It's going to be the same as a higher elevation, high severity, and we've reset the whole thing. Okay, we all know that from our experience last year. Don't forget this whole fire thing. If you live in a place where there's ponderosa pine trees, it's a when it's going to catch on fire. It's not an if. It's not an if. It's like living in the floodplain. We've got a flood channel right next to you. Oh, no, it never flooded since we've lived here. Well, hold your breath. That's right. So that's okay. I mean, it's just a fact. And so that's what we're dealing with. Okay. So current conditions, how about that house? Is that one fire standards? Well, besides the shake roof and the wood pile next to it. Jamie, do you want to go talk to that guy? Actually, I gotta say, this guy, we were out there on a site visit and say, he goes, yeah, I know. I don't care. There's nothing in there. If it burns down, it burns down. I like the birds. But this is what we have. We've got all these houses in the woods, and so, okay, we don't want this. That's my neighbor's house. It's so sad. We don't want that. That's the garage next door. We don't want that, because if you get these stand replacement fires in places that shouldn't have happened, you degraded that habitat for a long time. We're resetting it in ways that really, it's not quite right for that site. So what do we do if we're on landscape? Now we got a problem, because ecologically, the effects and the benefits and all those wonderful things from fire, chemically with the soil, the way that the patchiness and everything, fire is this. Can I cuss? Bill, can I cuss? Fire is scary as shit. What's scarier, drowning or burning up? Falling off a cliff or burning up? As we all know from last summer, fire is like, yeah, I get the chills just starting to think about it. And so to apply that as a management tool, good luck. Yeah, I know you will, some, but it's really hard to do. It's a real challenge. And so given these small-scale settings, what we wind up doing is we attempt to mimic fire mechanically. And this is what we do on a lot of the small parcels. I mean, my organization, DNR, and the conservation districts, this is our part and parcel. We push this all the time. We'll pay you 50% to hire these monkeys and go out there with that big machine and chew up the little trees. And it sort of mimics fire in that it reconfigures the woody stuff. I mean, you could pile it, you could burn it, and it does reduce the stocking. And so it's the tool we have, and frankly, it's a lower risk property-wise, so this is what we use. Now the outcomes to these thinning projects, and I'm segueing into kind of the heart of my little thing here. I mean, it can vary widely. Anybody thinking of doing a thinning? Yeah? Because if you get a contractor and you say, space them 14 feet up, that's what you'll get. And you won't necessarily have created the best habitat. You would have homogenized and simplified. So there's lots of different outcomes. There's different ways you can do that. I would argue that that's too clean. It's kind of like a golf coursey thing. But there's ways you can do it. Is that too messy? I put it in quotes because I've heard people say this. They say, well, I really want to clean up my forest. I say, well, wait, it's a forest. You need a broom? You know? And so it's a really interesting moment because essentially the best habitats tend to be messy. Wildlife in general really likes, you know, messy places. Dead trees, piles of logs, and all these sorts of things. So that might actually be a little bit messy. That might be too thick. They didn't cut enough trees there. But here's our objective, and that is to maintain habitat diversity and try to shoot for that zone on Bill's graph where they went across, where you got, you know, the highest abundance of and species richness while reducing the risk of stand replacing fire. Now, this is where we segue away from any sort of landscape scale ecology. We're actually down in the stand level, you know, thinking of what can you do in a treatment to provide some of this diversity. And there's a couple of examples right there. The guy on the left, their mulching machine made some snags. We recommended, they didn't have any snags. They'd all been cut down for firewood. So they made a whole bunch of it. It was kind of cool. So, yeah, so is there a sweet spot? Yeah, I would suggest there is a sweet spot. Boy, got an awe out of the cat. Yeah, so there are ways to do this, but it has to be conscious. That's really one of my points, is you gotta kind of get ahead of the curve and think about it. So the critters that will benefit indeed are across the whole range of things, you know, the bats in the roost, the bull snake under the log, the pileated using the snag, the flicker, the deer will have a place to eat when the shrubs come up, etc. So that's a general point about the abundance, aiming at a general stroke of habitat diversity rather than a specific type. So there you go. So this is all the way to one thing that has already come up, that in these dry forests, the big trees are the essential backbone feature. The backbone feature, that big, Bill, that big pine you showed with the orange stripe, how old was that tree?
Several hundred.
400, 500, 600 years old? Yeah. Jamie, how old are the bigger ones up on the wildlife area there?
Maybe 150.
Okay, 150. Some of those bigger ones, 250?
Yeah.
There you go. Jamie's our forester on the Methow wildlife area, so I'm going to put you on the spot there a little bit. And Rod's our other forester. The other guy, he's retired, so never mind. That's Doug Keene over there, Wade Doug, Department of Fish and Wildlife Forestry. So I'm concerned because I have some real forestry experts here. They're going to blow me out of the water. But the big trees are really important for all these reasons we've already said. They're the ecological staple point. And when we're doing our thinnings, in general, we're trying to grow big trees. That's a place where the thinning objective and the habitat objective absolutely overlap, because you're going to be freeing up some of those trees to try to get them bigger. When they get bigger, they've got more cones, they've got more surface area. And, you know, we don't even have to worry about whether or not they're going to be harvested for apple boxes in 50 years, frankly, because we're going to do what we can right now. So grow the big trees and keep the big trees. Yeah, and these legacy things can last a long time. So these dead trees, they can stand as long as they were alive. So you can have some of these old stands. I just heard this story from a lady at this point at a talk just a couple days ago, actually. And I said, does anybody know, I'll ask this question to this group, does anybody know of a snag somewhere that you've looked at for a long time? Up on a ridge somewhere, on your property, on a place you hike, a specific tree? You're nodding? Where is it?
Up on Cod Creek.
Up on Cup Creek? And how big is it? Pretty big, good size?
No, it's not that big. But
Okay.
yeah,
Is it buckskin? No bark on it?
no bark.
No bark. Yeah, so it's been there a while. Right, this lady described a ponderosa pine snag with no bark on it up on this ridge. And she said the guy they had bought the property from was this old guy. And he said when he had moved there in like 1905, 1910, something like that, that tree was already there and was already a buckskin snag. So he was familiar. So that tree had been there at least 100 years as a buckskin snag. The point being a witness to the longevity of some of these things. So some of those dead trees can last a long time and provide habitat for things like saw-whet owls, bluebirds, etc. I don't think I need to bang that point too hard. In your activities too, there'll be these things I just loosely call character trees. They're often with some kind of defect, sweet, fork top, that sort of thing. We used to think they had defective genetics, and usually it's some kind of a weather event. Something happened. That one on the right was struck by lightning and survived the Carlton fire. That one, who knows why it was tipped over. But they provide a lot of habitat structure in your trees. So in these thinnings, these are your tools for providing the habitat diversity that I'm speaking of. So I've got an acronym here that anyway. So we've got our snags, we've got our logs, we've got our openings, there's your diversity. We've got piles, meaning a way to artificially create some concentrations of downwood habitat. Patches, meaning areas you'll skip, and shrubs. That's a great acronym. SLOPS. Yeah, that has to go down there. So there's an example of an area that has a snag, a log, there's an opening, there's some, shrubs, a little bit, but not all of them, but that's the kind of idea where you can try to get your slops into your management activities so you would provide some of these habitat features. So just speaking to the snags and the importance of them, I brought in my one of my props that I use a lot. So when you see the snag and you see that little hole right there, look how deep, can you see how deep the cavity is? It's pretty remarkable. It goes down this far, and the woodpeckers make these things as a regular part of nesting and courtship behavior. So that woodpecker, like the hairy that I have here, I've got some specimens you're welcome to check out. I'll spread them out on the table. That's a study skin borrowed from Central Washington University. But woodpeckers have a combination chisel and tweezer attached to their head. And they bang on those trees and flick the chips off. And it's a totally remarkable behavior because they create openings inside of that woody cylinder that otherwise is unavailable to a whole bunch of species. So they're a keystone species because they allow cover, nesting habitat, all of that, inside of an otherwise solid piece of wood that would only be accessible just through a fluke. The tree breaks off, some weird thing. And so woodpeckers have this inordinately important role in the forest ecosystem for this reason in particular, and it's just pretty darn cool. So woodpeckers are worthy of obsession. I speak for myself. So snags are critical. Could you hear me in that whole litany just there? Yeah. Can I shout now, or I'll still use this? I know this room has such rotten acoustics. Yeah, so snags are really cool, and I probably don't need to bang on this too hard, because one of my goals is to convince people who otherwise think of them as being ugly or waste or something like that, whoa, no, like that one on the left is right along the road and is actually a prized habitat by a landowner just outside of Wenatchee, and there were kestrels that nested right up in that hole up in the top. Kestrel, sparrowhawk, I got some of those too, but you can't see them well. That one on the right, that could provide roosting habitat for bats under the bark, maybe a wren up in the top part, a chickadee, feeding substrate, and that's in a recently completed thinning unit, so that was pretty cool. The perfect snag is about 10 to 50 feet tall, big in diameter, with the top busted out of it so that it doesn't blow over as easily. Doug fir, pine, something like that. So a big woody cylinder that is able to withstand weather events. You think about the physics of it. And sometimes if they're big enough and they're in a good solid setting, those are the ones that last a long time. We actually think that their roots might be wrapped around rocks or something, just to hold them in place. So snags are cool. Snags are really clean under them, such as mice and voles and things like the rubber boas. They really like this stuff. Now, they do burn up in fires, and there is a reduction in some of the habitat quality, particularly from down wood when you have a lot of fires, but logs are good habitat too. Your openings will be the place where the shrub layer can come in and your understory can start to do a little better. That's not really an opening, but look at that bitter brush there, very flammable, we might add. Can you see the deer standing in the middle of that? So your openings can provide for the forbs and shrubs. This is artificial here, but this guy planted that one as some kind of a forage clovery mix, and the deer and the elk just loved it. Then the flip of the openings, it's almost like yin and yang, are patches. And this is one of the tools that people can actively use in their thinnings, because you can identify these little places where the shrubs or the small trees, like you wouldn't thin them. This would be one of those skips in a fire situation. But you do it on purpose, because if a contractor or a project is going through there, it's really, really tempting to use a simple prescription and go, 15, 20 feet, whatever, prune everything up. So these patches, and I like that one, because there's several different shrub species, and it breaks the sight distance across the more open stand. And the sight distance is important for a lot of these animals that we're so interested in, deer, bears, etc. I mean, they don't like it too open. So your patches can be a really pretty interesting feature. And we might add that as time goes on, you could go back and thin that again. So your patch and your opening are sort of a yin-yang of the same thing. If you had a totally closed canopy stand and you wanted to improve the habitat, you'd punch holes in it. You'd make some openings. If you had a totally open, anyway, you might want some patches. The other side of the black and white. This one is kind of interesting, because that person down there wanted privacy. So they left that patch in order to break the sight distance from those people's kitchen window, which totally makes sense. They didn't want to be able to see the house that was on the other side of the thin patch. And they also did a commercial harvest on this one too, so they did a commercial thinning too. So there you go. Oh, and there's a few of the species that benefit from these smaller diameter little patchy things. And this I just thought was cool. Bill, what kind of nest would that be? A little grassy cup right at the top of a grand fir, a little sapling grand fir. I don't know what kind of nest it was. There are many things it could be. There was a little grass nest right there in that top of the tree. And then a lot of times when deer have their fawns, you think about the times you stumbled on a fawn, a lot of times they're right up next to a log, they're right next to a clump of shrubbery, so that they're partly hidden on one side. So there are many animals that benefit from these little patches. Now here's the other one that people can really act on, and that are these piles. So you got to get rid of some of this biomass. You don't necessarily want to chip it all up. And snags and piles have something in common relative to people, and that is they're really fun to destroy. Who's ever burned a brush pile? I have. Isn't it fun? Who's ever cut down a snag? Dang right, I have too. Recreational logging, firewood, yeah, baby. Ooh. It's not necessarily good for the habitat, but so that one right there. There's a stand that got thinned out, and I don't know if they were leaving that on purpose. But look right in it, and here is a midden where the Douglas squirrel has gone in there and eats his little cones. So I really like Douglas squirrels. Uh-oh. Oh, sorry. I really like Douglas squirrels. What happened? Oh. No, he's dead. I didn't kill him. No, in regard to being a species that responds to this complexity, because if there's enough trees that have enough cones and enough places for them to hide, these guys will be there. Everybody knows them. But if you open it up too much, they can't be there. They'll travel through, but they won't be there, full time. So Douglas squirrel is a nice species that responds to. Are you want to hold him? You can pass him around. Don't grab him by the tail. His name was Ferdinand. No, I'm kidding. Check out the little tag on there too. He's been in the collection for like 25 years. Yeah. So there's the midden. There's the midden pile there where the squirrel would go and eat the cones. You ever see where they eat them like corn cobs? Because the seeds, and they'll go to the same spot and they'll cache them. So they'll gather the cones in the fall, and then they yell at each other in their territory. They've got territories of 5 to 20 acres, and they're these really feisty little guys. But point being, they love these piles, and they will use them. In that example right there, that may be the only place in a couple of acres there where the squirrel could have done that, where he could have hidden his stuff. So that could indeed be a critical habitat to that animal right there. So, what's a slash pile? Do a logging unit, I'll answer my own question. Slash pile, unconsolidated debris, usually from logging. A lot of dirt in it. Sometimes it's piled up. Sometimes it's huge with machinery, and it's really, it's all mishmashed in there. How about a brush pile? What's a brush pile? Usually prunings, smaller diameter stuff that you throw off the side, and it implies that it's waste, that it's sort of extra, that we're not going to keep it. I call these things habitat piles, and there's a reason that you can construct them on purpose, and then it's a habitat feature that on your small property you've said, I built that, I'm going to keep that. And so, the kind of a suggestion. So here's how you might do that, where you would make a couple of layers on the bottom of slightly bigger stuff, and then you cover it up with smaller layer, do like 3 to 5 layers down below, and then you cover it up like that, and you wind up with something like this. And since you've constructed it, you wouldn't burn it. You may still burn several of the other piles, but you could make 2 or 3 of these per acre, and you keep them. I got a diagram. If anybody's interested, I actually stole some ideas here from. And I've got the amazing demonstration. Bill, you want to be part of my amazing demonstration? Come up here. Come on down. Now, for those who are familiar with the various agencies, this is the sort of sophistication that the Department of Natural Resources brings to these events. So these are scale models of trees. I collected them myself. And so you would put several layers on the bottom. Can you see this? And then you would crisscross. And then what about your third, fourth, or fifth layer? Put them side to side with the idea that snow load would stop right there, and you would still have a cavity down underneath. Build a little bobcat house or a snowshoe hare house. And so you would deliberately do that, and then you take your little stuff, and if you're really going to get fancy, you stick one in as a perch so the bluebird can sit up there. And it doesn't really matter if the stuff on top has leaves on it or not, meaning needles, because they're going to fall off anyway. I don't know, just whatever you can. But when you're doing your thinning project and you have a bunch of stuff that's like that big around, you can. This is what you do with a proportion of it. Good. How does it feel to be a habitat feature? Excellent. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and one of the beautiful things about making these kind of piles is it's something you can do. You can go do this on Saturday, and you get rid of two things at once. Good job, Bill. Thank you. It's here for Bill.